This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guests today are Peter Gower and Chris Menges. Peter is the Nature Conservancy's Climate and Renewable Energy Program Director for the Western United States and Canada divisions, and Chris is the Director of Climate Action for the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Both Peter and Chris are on the front lines of North America's transition from fossil fuels to renewables, working to find solutions that protect and benefit working lands, natural landscapes, wildlife, and communities. As you'll hear in this episode, the transition from fossil fuels to renewables is an incredibly complex process, and Peter and Chris are highly skilled at breaking down the issues and explaining them in a detailed yet easy-to-understand manner. While the specifics of their work may be complicated, everything Peter and Chris do is built on the very simple foundation of strong relationships, partnerships, and trust, which has been the common theme of all of these TNC-focused episodes. We connected virtually and had a great conversation about the Nature Conservancy's work in the renewable space, exploring everything from TNC's big-picture strategies in the American West down to a few on-the-ground examples of specific successful initiatives and projects. We talked about how TNC is working with Western states to help them achieve their energy goals, and we discussed some of the specific renewable projects being done here in Colorado. We also talked about the challenges of finding sites for their renewable energy projects, how market incentives can be used to ensure siting that benefits both people and nature, and recently passed legislation here in Colorado that addresses these issues. We chatted about TNC's extensive research in the renewable space, including its power of place studies. And as usual, we discussed their favorite books, and they offer some resources to learn more about the issues surrounding renewable energy. Renewable energy has long been one of those topics that I've never been able to fully wrap my head around, but after this conversation, I felt that I finally had a solid foundation of knowledge, as well as the curiosity and desire to go out and learn more. A huge thanks to Peter and Chris for devoting the time to have this extremely educational conversation, and thank you for listening. All right, Peter and Chris, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to chat with me. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while, and I always say that this podcast is somewhat of a selfish project because I learned so much, and in preparing for this, I feel like I basically quadrupled my knowledge of renewables in the West, so thank you for that. I think I will have introduced both of you pretty clearly in the intro to this, so I say we just get right into it. And Peter, I was wondering if we could start with you, and I'd love to hear more about just kind of the renewable landscape in the West. I'd love to hear about TNC's goals for renewables in the West, and then how those kind of dovetail with different states and different regions. And I know that lots of states have different goals, and I'd love to hear just kind of how TNC thinks about renewables and how you think about partnering with different governmental organizations or communities to put these, to make renewable energy more of a reality in the West. So I'll just get out of the way and let you go.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ed. And great question. And, it's exciting work, and it's an exciting time to be involved in this work. And, it really starts with TNC's mission, which is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And that really guides our work and everything that we do, including in the climate and energy space. And, we really recognize the importance, especially in the West, of conserving all of the great landscapes that people enjoy recreating in and visiting, and that provide such important habitat for wildlife and all of the cultural values that are embodied in that landscape. At the same time, we have these super ambitious climate goals. For example, our goal in the West is to avoid about 90 million metric tons of CO2 emissions. And just to put some context around that number, that's about the emissions from 20 million cars a year. So it's,
wow.
It's a pretty big effort that we're trying to undertake here. And, the thing is that there's just going to be this continuing demand for electricity going forward as cars start turning to EVs, appliances and buildings become more electrified. Things like data centers just are going to require a whole lot more power. So that's why we're trying to get involved in a way that makes sense to get that clean energy on the grid as soon as possible. We call it, accelerating that clean energy transition, but really doing it in a way that minimizes and avoids as much as possible those conflicts with nature, people, and cultural values.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed as I was researching this and preparing for this interview is, in my mind, and correct me if I'm off on this, but it seems like there's no way around it. There's going to be this transition to renewable for a lot of reasons, economic being a big one. And so it seems like TNC and all the partners you guys work with are coming in and, they see that this is going to happen. So we're like, you're thinking, how can we make this the most efficient and the most, from an environmental conservation standpoint, have the best possible impact on wildlife, people, all that kind of stuff. I mean, do you see it that way? Is that it's coming no matter what? And so we might as well think about it, get ahead of it and think about it from a conservation standpoint. Am I correct in my thinking there?
Absolutely. And I mean, you nailed it. Taking that kind of that whole systems wide big lens approach at the beginning and saying, yeah, we need this balance. We know this transition is happening, but yeah, let's do it in a way that really allows us to, at the same time, have these great places that we love in the West, and that the wildlife, and have so many of those natural values conserve for the long term, because that's a key part of the equation as well.
And Chris, I'd love to hear from you. We're both located here in Colorado, and when you kind of zoom down to the state where we live, I know that there have been some really ambitious goals set by the state government, and TNC is working in partnership with them to make those goals a reality in the best possible way. And so could you talk a bit about your work on the ground in Colorado and how you think about TNC being kind of a lever to make this work on a statewide scale?
So, I would start off by thinking a little bit about how TNC's renewable energy work in the West complements state goals for the renewable energy transition. And to set the context, Colorado has a goal of essentially being net zero across the entire economy by 2040. The power sector plays a really important role in that. And our utilities are planning on essentially being 100% clean or renewable by 2030. So as we start to understand that, we get a little bit more of an understanding of, what the scale of this transition actually looks like. And the most recent analysis that we have says that this will require building 5 times the existing solar that we have, 3 times the existing wind that we have, and a fair amount of accompanying storage, as well as a significant amount of energy transmission infrastructure. So it's a pretty significant footprint, but we do think we have an opportunity to do it right, and our science says that we can. I'll say, most of the infrastructure I'm talking about here is likely to be utility scale, but we're also fortunate that Colorado is moving forward with plans for distributed and community solar as well, which helps kind of ease some of the demand for some of the utility scale infrastructure. And big picture, we're really fortunate to have voters that support the clean energy transition and a governor and a legislature that reflects that. And I'll say as a quick note on an exciting kind of TNC connection, Bill Ritter, who is a former Colorado governor, is on our board. And I think many across the West really see him as being instrumental in catalyzing the clean energy transition in Colorado during his administration, and believe that a lot of those early successes have helped inspire broader action in Western states. In terms of partnerships, I think that's one of the really exciting things about this issue. It affects everyone, and almost all interest groups, are interested in this issue and have important insights and value to add to the discussion about how clean energy infrastructure should be built. And while we at TNC think most deeply about opportunities to align clean energy deployment with climate conservation and community outcomes, we really realize that a successful result will involve understanding the context and needs of all of these groups, say agriculture, labor, environmental justice, the business community, really all of the groups that have a stake in this issue. And TNC has a unique opportunity to, work at the intersection of all of those groups so that we can help position solutions that work for everybody, and then that also maintain those really positive outcomes for people and nature at its core. So, I think for here, the opportunity to work with a wide range of folks is one of the most exciting parts of the work. And it really also reflects, I think, where climate work is now. And that is, we've kind of gone from a shift from target setting. And when I say target setting, I mean setting like renewable energy standards, into implementation, which is building and deploying the stuff we actually need to achieve those targets. And that's really exciting work that we feel really fortunate to be a part of.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, that brings me exactly to my next question. We're, talking about all the renewable energy infrastructure that is going to have to be built as part of this effort. And just as it's going to happen one way or another, so we might as well do it correctly. Can you talk a bit about some of the challenges and opportunities of finding suitable sites for building these, the infrastructure, whether it's solar panels or wind turbines or the transmission that's needed to get it to the consumer? I'd love to hear more about how you do that while balancing agriculture, balancing wildlife, and just doing it in a mindful way going forward. Can you kind of give everybody a overview of how you think about that?
Peter can speak to that as well, but I'll say, my first caveat here is that I'm not a professional renewable energy real estate acquisition professional. And, those folks really have a detailed view of what it takes to identify suitable sites. And, in particular, ones that are both economically viable and low conflict from a conservation and community perspective. And I say that because, from my perspective, that's kind of the challenge. And that challenge reflects a few basic facts. The first is that throughout the West, I think there are likely many individuals and interests that care deeply about almost every square acre of private and public land,
yes,
that might be suitable for development. And the second is that our current market incentives for energy projects generally favor development on greenfields, which are previously undisturbed areas. So you're kind of looking at the basic factors are what's the least cost to develop and permit, and what is closest to interconnection and transmission. Now, we know that energy affordability is very important in the clean energy transition, and especially as we prioritize access, equity, and, really an overall understanding that costs have increased across the board for everyone, and that a goal of many of, the administration's core setting policy today is to maintain a level of affordability. So really the way I see the opportunity in terms of, driving more suitable sites for renewables from a people and wildlife perspectives is policies to incentivize that most suitable sites from a cost and power generation perspective are aligned with the most suitable sites from a public interest perspective. And there are conceptual opportunities to achieve this, a number of groups working with relevant partners on it. And these are conversations that are occurring in, really technical proceedings and venues like public utility commissions. So, at the macro level, we think there are some upgrades and tweaks to the market dynamics that can be made to actually incentivize building in the most suitable areas.
Do you have any specific examples of some of those things that could incentivize folks? I mean, maybe just one high level one.
Sure. An example, and I wasn't necessarily going to lead with this because it's slightly technical, but generally the way that, and this is just speaking for Colorado, most renewable energy project proposals are made based on utility resource plans from large utilities like Xcel Energy and bids that they have accepted by renewable energy developers that meet criteria that are set by the Public Utilities Commission. Those criteria focus most heavily on cost. And there's an idea in certain circles that expanding the criteria to include what we would call non-price factors. Those non-price factors would be things like impacts on wildlife and prime ag land, for example. Of course, this would have to go through extensive, analysis review. But the concept would be that including non-price factors in Public Utility Commission criteria for utility resource planning bids would influence projects to account for those factors from the start and be awarded with the opportunity to develop.
That's interesting. And when I think of, from my perspective, my background is conservation, particularly putting easements on properties. And I think it reminds me a bit of how here in Colorado, the easements are valued based on development value, basically, but that's not the full picture. It's kind of just a ridiculously simplified way to think about it. And so there's a lot of efforts in place to figure out ways to value the land based on ecology or based on a whole host of other kind of factors that allows you to get a much more complex and accurate idea of value. And it seems like it's kind of a similar, there's been this one way of measuring it that's been done by the utilities that has worked, but we need to take it to a different level of complexity. Is that an accurate kind of comparison from my kind of boneheaded way of looking at things?
Yes, that's accurate. And I would say, I also have a pretty cursory understanding of what I was just describing. And there are folks that, work in this complexity day in and day out who could describe it better. But yes, that is generally accurate. And I'll also quickly say that as we look at this set of issues, we're looking at a number of levers and chatting with partners in the field. The PUC non-price factor approach that I was describing is one potential lever. We've seen other states use other levers, like simply providing, direct incentives, such as, per kilowatt or per megawatt hour rebates or tax breaks to projects that develop in low impact areas. So as we stand up, conversations in Colorado, we really want to be able to eventually advocate for solutions that are durable, viable, and equitable. So we want to explore, a number of the different levers that can help us, get at this opportunity and then, pursue the one that really makes the most sense for Colorado.
Yeah. That all sounds great. And I always think about, this stuff, whether it's renewable energy. I used to do a lot of stuff with water. you can, there are obviously so many of these, these true experts behind the scenes, but I've found that they all obviously do great work, but there's a lot of value in folks like you who can explain it to somebody like me. Because when I get really, really technical, sometimes I can't take it all in. So I think that's a really a wonderful explanation. Peter, as you think about this from a broader perspective over the whole West, is there anything you would have to add to what Chris said?
I think Chris answered it really well. I think the only thing that I would add is that, there's an opportunity to, Chris mentioned incentivizing, and I think that's great, and doing that through policies and through the planning process. Something that we've noticed is that a lot of the community involvement, really the decision making is happening at that project level scale. And at that point, it's tough for changes to be made to, project scopes, people to, react and shift gears. So really front loading the process a little bit better with good information, good science to identify those suitable sites ahead of time, and kind of doing that wraparound approach with policy and planning and just with that permitting structure can really help drive, future projects to those lower conflict areas. And just as an example of a tool that we have available, it's called our Site Renewables Right tool. And it's essentially a screening tool where you can pull up various layers of data and see where there are various types of wildlife habitat, other resources to just help inform a siting process.
Yeah, well, that was another thing that really came to mind as I was preparing for this, is just the amount of you said good information. TNC seems to have been able to, along with its partners, really just put together a lot of very, very complex information into a format that's both useful and understandable for a broad audience. And that reminds me of your Power of Place study that came out I think it was about this time last year. And I remember seeing that soon after it came out. And I know that that's been a really useful tool. And then it's led to some other tools that are coming out. And so, Peter, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that Power of Place study, kind of what was the genesis of putting all your resources into creating that, and then kind of what is being built off of the top of that.
So Power of Place started, we actually have 3 different Power of Place studies, and it started with the first one back in 2019, where we looked at what it would take to meet California's renewable energy goals, both within the state and throughout neighboring states, how to get that clean energy to California to meet their goals. We expanded that a couple years later with our Power of Place West study, which looked at West-wide decarbonization goals by 2050. And then the report that you mentioned that came out most recently expanded that lens even further to look at all of the lower 48 states. I want to focus in kind of on this Power of Place West study because it really covers the geography that we're talking about. And we started with 200 data layers, environmental data layers, and that helped us identify where are some of the areas where we would expect there to be conflicts with renewable energy development, with transmission development, with some of these really high value conservation areas. And we called those the environmental exclusion areas. Those came off the table in this model of potential energy development. And we ran a few different scenarios with the strength of those exclusion areas. We added in some key assumptions, things like distributed energy generation opportunities, energy efficiency, added in some things about transmission siting and siting technologies, even some carbon management technologies into this range of scenarios. And ultimately what our analysis showed for Power of Place West is that we can achieve economy-wide net zero greenhouse gas emissions meet the energy needs, clean energy needs of the West while avoiding the most sensitive natural and working land. So really getting that energy generation, the transmission on those least conflict areas. So it was really exciting to see the outcomes of that analysis. And we have a lot of mapping information, so you can look at it kind of at the macro scale and see where some of these sites are. Another component to it that we found is that obviously grid expansion, grid capacity, the transmission system is a key component to this renewable energy build out that we've been talking about. Putting lines all across the landscape in the West is a concerning outcome. What we found is that 50% of the grid expansion needed to meet that 2050 net zero outcome can be achieved through low impact strategies, things like reconductoring existing power lines, which is essentially putting different wires on those power poles that is more efficient at moving those electrons. And other strategies like putting lines right next to existing transmission lines or next to existing roads and corridors where there's already that disturbance. So we can do 50% of that grid upgrading through strategies like that.
One question that comes to mind on that is, when I read the report and when I hear you describe it, I mean, it sounds like a win-win. I mean, it seems like it's, not a no-brainer by any means because it's very complicated, but it seems like a very kind of mindful and effective way to go about this, particularly like reworking some of the existing infrastructure. What are the obstacles to that? I mean, is it just kind of the status quo of this is that we've never done it, we've always done it this way, and this is how we're going to do it? But like when you think about the challenges of actually implementing these ideas, what are the main challenges that you think of? I mean, I guess money's a big one.
Money's always a big one, sure.
Yeah, that's it.
And the enabling policies. As Chris mentioned before, are critical. Enabling plans and permitting frameworks are also essential. I mean, right now, a lot of the West is kind of structured in those two areas to really any area is kind of on equal footing, both in terms of environmental and economic perspective. It's obviously an oversimplification. There are wilderness areas and those types of places that you can't just plop in a huge solar farm. But, by prioritizing and giving those incentives to those lower conflict areas, it can really help from that economic perspective, make them more affordable. And from like a permitting perspective, they've already been essentially vetted for conflicts. So in theory, projects can move ahead faster. And Ed, just to give you an example, TNC and many of our partners were involved recently in the BLM's solar programmatic planning process. This process was to look at, okay, where are these least conflict areas in the West for utility scale solar siting? And how can we, one, identify those areas, and two, kind of wrap around those incentives to drive development to those areas? So TNC was involved. We brought our power of place science to that conversation, and we thought it was really effective in essentially partnering with the BLM and sharing that information of where these areas are and what this build out scenario could look like. So we're really excited to see the final plan that's supposed to come out in a few months. And then at the same time, the Department of Interior is doing this rulemaking process that will create those incentives, those wraparound components that can help really make those areas more attractive for development.
I don't want to jump in, but if I can, I would with just another example on the transmission side. Is that
Please.
Okay?
Oh, yeah, it's always okay.
Yeah. So, you're kind of asking what's the barrier between kind of like taking, the great idea on, let's say, transmission reconductoring existing rights of way and grid enhancing technologies. So those are essentially all ways of using either existing corridors or existing infrastructure and rewiring or upgrading them to bring, more energy across those existing corridors and, therefore kind of like somewhat reduce the need to build new transmission infrastructure or brand new corridors. So great concept. And, again, the opportunity generally comes back to how policy informs markets and economics. One of the, identified opportunities is that if we're able to essentially calibrate the total cost of or if we're able to structure the total cost of electricity delivery in a way that is supportive of including kind of the complete picture of either saving money by reconductoring versus building new transmission infrastructure, that would incentivize what we're most interested in, which is kind of the reconductoring component. And that's something that, many smart folks are contemplating and looking at. It becomes especially complex because there are so many venues in which transmission decisions are made, and they span from utility scale to state to federal. So aligning policies across those to kind of match the transmission system, is one of, kind of the large opportunities that's on the horizon. And again, probably didn't explain that super well, but wanted to kind of, it's a really similar concept to what we're talking about in siting.
You don't give yourself enough credit. You definitely explained it very well. If I can understand it, anybody can understand. Because that's the thing. When I was doing water work, we had to, some of the things we were doing, we had to go through a water court on a particular project I was working on, and one of the things I noticed through that was some of the, there was going to be some potential impact on the project because of the project we were using on some water rights that were owned by utility companies. And all the folks at the utility companies were great, but it was clear to me that there's just this status quo that has been in place for a very long time, and it can just be challenging to inject new ideas, not only just to inject the new ideas, but then to also get those ideas into action. And so I love hearing about everything you are doing, because it's this, I would imagine it's just kind of a slow build of getting all the players' ideas, heads around these new ideas. And I would guess that it's kind of a slow build. And then eventually, like the wave's going to break, and there's going to be a lot of action on the ground. I want to talk about one more report that you guys are working on, as much as you can talk about. I know it hasn't come out yet, but I know the Power of Place study kind of informed a new study that's coming out called the Connected West study. And Peter, I guess, could you talk a bit about the kind of the goals for that study and what you're hoping to get out of that?
The Connected West study is actually being led up by our partners at Grid Lab and GridWorks. Mm-hmm. So we're really excited that the experts in transmission are doing the work there. And this much anticipated study will use we call them our candidate project areas that were identified through that Power of Place modeling exercise, those low impact areas. And Connected West does a deeper dive into the transmission side of the equation, looks at some of the things that Chris was talking about, looks at some of the key corridors to connect those low impact generation zones, thinking of them as like the catchment zones for those clean electrons, and how looks at the pathways to get those electrons to the demand centers throughout the West. So it's really a more complex modeling exercise looking at those corridors for transmission. We're expecting that report to be out hopefully in about 2 months. It is much anticipated, and it's really going to be just another tool in the toolbox to inform some of these conversations that we've been talking about like in the policy and the planning space. So very excited for that.
Yeah, and I'll have links to everything we're discussing here in the episode notes so folks can see. And then when that report comes out, I'll definitely send it out on all my various platforms so people can check it out, because the little bit that I was able to see in advance is pretty inspiring stuff. One of the things that has come up in really literally every single one of these TNC-focused episodes is this power of partnership, and how everything TNC does is really the result of having very, very strong, trusting relationships with a wide variety of stakeholders. And so what is, in my mind, what's different about what we're talking about here is that you're talking about relationships with public utilities. You're talking about relationships with government agencies. It's less about, like, for example, Matt Moorhead is out forming these long-term, multi-decade relationships with ranchers on the ground, whereas you guys are figuring out ways to form relationships with these big, massive entities that have been in place for a very long time. You mentioned your partnership with the BLM. You've mentioned some of your work with different utilities. I wonder if, Peter, if you could just expand a bit on how you think about building relationships with entities, such as Xcel Energy or, any of these large entities that to the average person may just seem like a big company, but you guys are building these lasting relationships that allow you to actually make changes in a world that's has a lot of inertia. And so could you just expand a bit on how you think about building these trusting relationships?
Yes, and I think it really comes down to how we approach these relationships, and we approach it with a solutions-oriented mindset. I mean, we value the partnerships, we value the expertise of our partners, and where there are these challenges, we really want to work with our partners to find solutions to these just amazingly complex challenges, and a lot of times. And, we bring to the table things like the power place work or the site renewables right work, that objective science-based perspective to try to find, just good win-win outcomes. You mentioned some of the local relationships. I think that's the other great thing about TNC is that, we have, folks who are in the communities throughout all of the states and the West and nationwide, working hand in hand with our partners, at that local level. So, I mean, it's really that multifaceted approach, and we try to, where we can, elevate the voices of our partners, amplifying all the great things that they're doing and supporting their work. And then just more specifically to the energy work that we do, Chris alluded to it earlier, and we try to take a 3C approach, and that's community, conservation, and climate. And community is such a huge part of that. I mean, we can't move forward with our conservation goals and our climate goals without respecting the voices and the needs of our community partners. And that includes local rural communities, urban residents, indigenous tribal communities.
Chris, I know that you have been working on, you recently had a big win here in Colorado with some legislation that kind of speaks to TNC's power of building these relationships and being able to bring a bunch of stakeholders together. And so could you just give kind of an overview, and then I'll have some specific follow-ups. I mean, we could spend an entire podcast episode talking about SB 212, but can you talk about that legislation and kind of its goal and its purpose and how this group of stakeholders managed to push it through?
Yes. So SB 212 was recently signed into law by Governor Polis this past May, and it does a few things that we're really excited about. Primarily, it creates new state resources to help local governments and tribes make siting and permitting decisions about renewable energy projects that are both more efficient and better for their communities. And frequently, we think better for their communities means addressing concerns related to wildlife habitat and prime ag or ranch lands. So the bill really creates resources that are both technical and that provide actual consultation from state agencies. On the technical side, it creates a compendium of local codes that address wind, solar, energy storage, and transmission projects. And then local governments and tribes can look at those as they shape or update their own codes. And this is a good time to point out that local governments are ultimately the primary permitting entity or authority on renewable energy projects in Colorado. So the bill is also going to identify high priority habitats related to renewable energy infrastructure based on the best available science and make this information available to local governments and tribes. So that will be another resource that they can consider and utilize as they're making permitting decisions. And then it creates technical support directly from state agencies that will be available to local governments upon request to review proposed energy projects, identify best management practices to avoid, minimize, and mitigate wildlife impacts. And then those practices are, voluntarily adoptable to be incorporated into project plans. I'll say one thing that we're excited about with the bill is that it includes an important tribal sovereignty component. Specifically, it will require a local government to consult with tribal governments about potential impacts to hunting, fishing, and gathering rights for any project that's proposed in the Bruno Agreement area in southwest Colorado. And generally, we do feel like this is a really great step towards the low conflict clean energy future that we envision. I will say that we worked with a coalition of 6 NGOs that engaged 9 partner groups over a year and a half prior to the bill being introduced. And the bill that we had originally negotiated and envisioned was quite a bit more robust. It originally envisioned actual requirements for wildlife protection and then limits on other restrictions like moratoria that could slow renewable energy development. Ultimately, the sponsors didn't think that the larger package was viable at the time, primarily because of the strong desire of local governments to maintain full control over permitting decisions. And, I think where things came out were essentially the right place. I was speaking earlier about broad support for renewable energy in Colorado. I think if we had, pushed forward a bill that significantly rebalanced state and local authority as a first step, it could have risked turning renewable energy development into a bit of a wedge issue, which it's not currently. That wouldn't have been good for any outcomes. The bill is responsive to that in that it also creates a report to the General Assembly that will be out in September 2025. That report will evaluate local government siting processes. It will identify low conflict areas for renewables, and it will evaluate further opportunities for wildlife mitigation, decommissioning of projects, and community benefit agreements. Those were all things that were originally considered in the original bill. And I think that report will create an important kind of empirical basis for ongoing conversations with a lot of the partners that we engaged over the past year and a half. And we're hopeful that, given the outcome of the legislation this year and kind of SB 212 as, an initial step towards this, this efficient, low conflict approach, we're hopeful that future conversations can follow really the same productive tone as the discussions we've hosted over the past year and a half on this.
Yeah, it seems like it's obviously a huge victory by itself, but just
it just sets a precedent from my perspective. It seems to set a precedent for productive, action-oriented conversations on a very complex issue, which, given the political climate everywhere these days, I mean, that's a huge win in itself. Was this legislation based on anything that had been done throughout the West or throughout the country in the past, or was this where did the idea for this come from? Because it seems like a first of its kind thing, at least that I know of.
Yes. So that's a great question. And there certainly has been siting legislation both around the West and around the country. I think, from my perspective, there are some great examples. And we're also seeing that, there are slight nuances in many of the state siting policies, and they all have various trade-offs. Other siting policies in other states are certainly something that we looked at very extensively and that we brought into discussions with all of the partner groups for their consideration. And, we, in addition to bringing examples from other states, we also provided polling data from voters in the state, as well as insights from Power of Place, which is kind of the scientific basis that says, we can do this. This is possible. Here's an opportunity. Let's try to figure out how to make this work in a Colorado context and in a way that works for all of the groups that are at the table.
I love hearing that because it makes me think about, I always think about conservation projects in that you want them to obviously benefit the local community or the community where it's directed. But if they can have these ripple effects that go out beyond, far beyond the local community. And I think the creation of this based on some other ideas from the past, and then you think, you go forward about 5, 6, 7 years in the future, and how some other organizations throughout the West may use this particular piece of legislation to build one that's even better. I think it's important for people to really know how the kind of incremental it is and how it builds on itself over many, many years. So I love hearing that. Peter, I was wondering if I could go back to you for a minute. One of the pieces of information I was looking at before I started, as I was preparing for this interview, was how TNC is working to figure out ways to build more renewable energy sites on brownfields or areas that have been, maybe previously contaminated, previously mining operations or whatever. Because I think a lot of times people think about utilities built in a wide open meadow out in eastern Colorado on grasslands or whatever, but you guys are figuring out ways to kind of reuse these spots that have already been used up in some ways. Could you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, the opportunity on these previously disturbed sites is exciting because it can really be a win-win outcome for the sites. The investing in renewable energy, whether it's solar or even battery storage, potentially wind technology on these sites, can bring that needed investment to the sites to clean them up and repurpose them for an end use that really can be a benefit for the community and a benefit for the climate. So lots of win-win outcomes there. It's a concept that is also part of the EPA's kind of program. They have this repowering program, so you can pop onto their site and look at some of the projects that have already been developed on brownfields. At TNC, we call it our Mining the Sun program. And we have some great case studies that are coming online here. One exciting one recently is the Starfire project. It's a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, Bright Night, and Rivian, the automotive company.
The car company.
Yeah. And so this project at the end of it will hopefully develop or hopefully produce about 800 megawatts of solar energy on a former coal mine in Kentucky. Rivian would be the off-taker of the energy. So all of that clean energy would help them be, more of a net zero company, bringing lots of new jobs and investments to the site there. So It's really an opportunity to bring together for TNC's, involvement in this work, bring these partners together, the landowners, the local governments, the potential off-takers of the power, and try to find these sites and then bring these partners together to find opportunities to redevelop them. So we're really excited about this. We have a report that came out, really summarizing our findings from the first several years of our work that came out just last month. So excited to share that.
Cool. Well, I'll look forward to reading that myself. And again, links to all this will be in the episode notes. And we're on a relatively limited time frame here, so I want to be very respectful of y'all's time, because obviously you're doing all this important work. The last thing you need to be doing is wasting time talking to me and answering my questions, but I appreciate it. Kind of one final question for both of you. I feel like any good conversation or any good book, I feel like the way I judge it is that it makes me want to go and learn more about whatever I was talking about or reading about. And obviously, I've got a lot to learn about renewable energy and how complex it is and all the opportunities. And so I was wondering if you had any resources. It could be books, could be films, just anything that comes to mind that you think would be a good resource for the folks who are listening to this, to go and learn more, to kind of further the depth of their knowledge on all these important issues. Peter, maybe I'll start with you. Any where you could direct me to go?
And Ed, when you said a book recommendation, I was thinking something that kind of, inspired my work in this space. And I
want that too. Tell me that. I'd probably understand that more than I would if I got into all the depths of renewable energy. I'd love to hear that, actually.
And my response was going to be, anything from Bill Bryson or Jared Diamond. And I say that because, like, Bill Bryson and his short history of nearly everything, that's just an example of how to be curious, but also try not to take things too seriously. You can get pretty dark with some of this stuff. These are big challenges that we're facing here, like Jared Diamond talks about in his book, Collapse.
Whew.
But this is exactly why we're working in this space. We're trying to find solutions, and we're trying to do it in a way that is positively focused and looking at where we can find these solutions. So, and I'd be happy to share some other resources on the energy side of things. But yeah, just kind of big picture. That's a couple thoughts there.
I think those are both great. Both of those authors have been highly influential in the way I think about things, and just kind of a foundational way of thinking about all these complicated issues. And that's a good combo too, because Jared Diamond can make you feel kind of really worried, and then Bill Bryson will make you laugh really hard. So I like
exactly.
Chris, do you have any books to add to that?
Sure. Well, if it's okay, I'll actually add a couple of podcasts.
Please.
I think for me, I so appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast as somebody who absolutely loves this format as a way of thinking about some of these complex issues. So two that are especially resonant to me recently are the Ezra Klein podcast, because he frequently does episodes that explore what, I think he kind of terms the environmentalism of stopping things, transitioning into the environmentalism of building things. And the guests that he engages around this topic and just some of the thinking that they're sharing there is obviously, really, really important for us to kind of be aware of and think about as we're essentially doing the same. And then I also really like a podcast called Political Climate, and I think it's by Canary Media. And their format, centers on positioning hot topics for, more of a technical and practitioner audience, but positioning discussions with a D and an R commentator. And it's, both of these folks, kind of like TNC, we're a nonpartisan organization, and we're focused on finding positive outcomes and solutions at the intersection of multiple perspectives. So political climate, is another just kind of like great preview and thought exercise in hearing from different perspectives on some of the key topics and opportunities, and would definitely recommend that one to folks that like to think about some of these issues of the day.
Those are great. I love Ezra Klein, but I've not listened to the other, so I'll cue it up. But all right, guys, y'all are so smart and such pros, and you make somebody like me who feels like I don't understand anything, understand all this complicated and very important work you're doing. So I really appreciate it. I appreciate y'all taking the time, and I'm going to look forward to following your progress in the future. But thank you both so much.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. It's been a real pleasure, and likewise, really appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.